Okay, so this is to talk about currency conversion in Mojaloop. And this is a work in progress, so any comments people might have would be most welcome. Right, so what do we want to talk about? First of all, our objectives, the overall objectives and the objectives for this PI. Next, the progress we've made against those objectives, a milestone analysis, changes to the API, and finally talk about content, which we break down into what we expect a foreign exchange provider, an FXP, to do, what we expect a DFSP to do, and what we expect the switch to do. So let's start then with the objectives. Our overall objective, as it has, I think, always been, is to work through foreign exchange providers, specialists who provide currency conversion services to other DFSPs in the system. This, we've always said, is a role, it's not an entity type. So being a foreign exchange provider doesn't mean you can't be also a participant in the system. On the other hand, it's possible just to be a foreign exchange provider in the system. But on the other hand, you do have to be a settling participant. You have to be able to settle funds with other participants in the system. We want to support two different types of currency conversion, bulk and payment versus payment. And bulk conversion, the DFSP who requests the conversion receives the funds in the converted currency, and it can then do with them as it will. So it maintains a ledger in that currency and it can settle in converted funds. So, for instance, if my, let's say, home currency is Malawian kwacha, and I frequently deal with with customers who transact in Zambian kwacha, it would be possible for me to do a bulk purchase of Zambian kwacha, and then simply to have transfers routed against that balance when I've got it. So rather than getting currency conversion each time. In payment versus payment conversion, funds are only converted for a single payment, a single transfer. And the conversion is not executed unless the transfer succeeds. In the bulk transfer, you get the funds and it's up to you how you use them. In the payment versus payment transfer, you don't get the converted funds unless payment itself succeeds. And each DFSP only transacts and only settles in its home currency. So the DFSPs themselves don't need to worry about any form of currency conversion. It's the foreign exchange provider who's responsible for all of that. So overall, we want to allow either the creditor or the debtor participant to perform the conversion. This is a transaction between a DFSP and the foreign exchange provider. We did in previous designs think that the switch ought to be managing this. We've moved away from that and said that essentially the normal principle of the Mojaloop system is that this is a conversation between participants, and although the switch routes the messages, it should be doing the minimum in terms of actually doing things as a consequence. We also think it would be possible to have both the creditor and the debtor participant perform a currency conversion, which, if it were appropriate, would also allow use of a reference currency. We don't say that that's got to happen, but we say it could happen. Now, if the debtor participant performs the conversion, then the transfer will be denominated in the target currency. If the creditor participant performs the conversion, contrary-wise, it's denominated in the source currency. And the other thing that we want to do is to make sure that reservations are made against the correct accounts, because you can probably see now that depending on whether it's the creditor participant or the debtor participant who undertakes currency conversion, the contents of the messages will be different from each other. And although they are different from each other, we want to make sure that the liquidity checks and the reservations are performed against the correct ledgers and against the correct participants. So we have some conversion work to do there, which I'll be talking about a bit later on. Right, so we have a candidate API, which is currently going through the evaluation process in the FSP-IOP special interest group. Those of you who are interested in participating should contact Henrik Carlson from Ericsson, who is the convener of that special interest group. Special interest groups are open to anybody who wants to attend, and the more the merrier as far as we're concerned. It's also available in GitHub on the issues page for the CCB. So we have some new endpoints. First of all is a services endpoint. That's also used by the PISP API. And in this case, services/FXP, it allows a participant to obtain a list of the participants in their scheme who offer a particular service, in this case, currency conversion. If it were used by the PISP API, it would be used to find a list of the DFSPs in a scheme who would support PISP linking. So that's something which, as I say, should already be there in the PISP API. So although it is a new endpoint, it's not a very new endpoint. Next, we have an FX version of quotes. And that is used by a DFSP to request the agreement of terms for a currency conversion. This doesn't specify whether the conversion is bulk or payment versus payment. And exactly as it would with a transfer, the foreign exchange provider responds with a condition which locks the terms of the conversion. Now, one of the things that scheme rules will have to do is it will have to ensure that the conversion is valid. The condition is valid for long enough to do the rest of the transfer. We do allow, or we propose as part of the API, an expiry date to be sent by the DFSP who's requesting the conversion to say, please give me a quote that will be valid until this time. So that's something which in previous incarnations was set by the FXP. Now we want it to be able to be set by the DFSP who's making the request. Second, we have an FX transfers endpoint, which is, you'll be amazed to hear, the corollary of the transfers endpoint in the existing FSP-IOP API. And that's used by a DFSP to request the execution of a previously agreed currency conversion. If the conversion is payment versus payment, then the transaction ID of the payment itself will be passed with the execution request. But if that's the case, the FXP will respond with the status reserved. This is analogous to the status that a DFSP responds with if it wants further notification from the switch as to whether the transfer has succeeded or failed. And the switch will then reserve funds against the correct accounts, and the correct accounts will be against the debtor DFSP in the source currency. The FXP in the target currency, that won't happen yet, but for the moment, it will just be one reservation. Now, by responding with the status reserved, the FXP resigns to the switch its ability to decide on the success or failure of the conversion. So this, again, is something that we would expect to see in the scheme rules, that by responding with a positive response and the status reserved, the FXP is saying, you can decide whether the transfer has succeeded or failed, and I will abide by your decision. As far as I'm concerned, it's succeeded, but it's your decision eventually. If it's not payment versus payment, then the FXP will respond in the normal way with the status committed, and the ledgers will be updated in the normal way. Now, we have also some changes to the existing endpoints in the FSP-IOP API. Those of you who are saying, what's happened to ISO 20022? My answer is it hasn't. So we're working on the FSBI OP API at the moment. We will produce an ISO 20022 version of this in the future once the overall principles have been agreed. First of all, there's a change to the put parties response, the response to address lookup. There's a change to the post quotes message and a change to the transaction object. In the put parties response, we produce a new data structure which enables the creditor DFSP to specify which currency or currencies the beneficiary can receive funds. So this enables the debtor DFSP to understand whether this is a transfer which requires currency conversion or not. Obviously, if the creditor DFSP's account can only receive in a currency pardon me, which the debtor can't issue in, then it will have to get some currency, some PVP currency conversion. This will involve the addition of a new optional structure to the party object, which is because effectively it describes an attribute of the person to whom the identifier refers. And we come round to the post quotes request, then we're going to add an optional field to allow the debtor DFSP to specify which of the parties should undertake currency conversion. We need this because in almost all cases you can infer this from the contents of the quote request. The one case in which you can't is where the beneficiary is expected to receive a set amount, and in that case, there will be the amount to be set will be expressed in the target currency, which would normally be taken by other parties to mean this is subject to currency conversion on the credit parties. On the debtor parties side. However, it's possible that a customer might say, I want to send 10,000 Malawian kwacha to this customer, and I want them to receive that amount. That means that even though the amount is in the target currency, it's not clear, not determined in advance, whether conversion is going to be carried out by the debtor party or by the creditor party. And therefore, we allow an optional field where the DFSP can specify which party they want to do the conversion. This will be an enumeration. We will also add one or more fields to allow the debtor DFSP to specify the dependencies associated with the transfer. Now, a dependent represents an associated action. In this case, it'll be a currency conversion whose success or failure depends on the success or failure of the transfer itself. So in a case where the debtor party is undertaking a foreign exchange currency conversion, they will add a dependent to the post quotes which they issue to say, and here is the dependent currency conversion on which this transfer depends. Now, this has got two components. The first is the FSP ID of the intermediary whose obligations are being registered. In this case, it'll be the FXP. And the second is the ILP condition for the intermediary operation. And this allows the switch, when it comes to interrogate these fields later on, to understand which reservation it should go looking for the currency conversion. Right, we have changes to the transaction object, and they are essentially the things that I've just talked about in relation to the post quotes, transferred across into the transaction object so that they will be passed around in the ILP packet associated with the transfer. Okay, so that covers the changes or proposed changes to the API. Now let's look at changes to the hub processing. Our assumptions are, first of all, each phase of the transfer, other than the transfer itself, will have a dependent entry associated with the transfer execution request. So you will always have a reference to the dependent activity, currency conversion in this case. The content of an entry will be as follows: the identifier of the party and the condition, as we've just said. And it's also an assumption of this that conditions will be unique in the lists of dependencies. That is, you won't see something appear in the dependencies list twice with the same condition attached. So conditions are unique in the list of dependencies. The core pattern then, we think, is we perform liquidity checks and create reservations when the individual requests to execute a payment are initially received. That is, the currency conversion and payment itself. These reservations must be created on the correct underlying accounts for the overall transfer. That is to say, a reservation in the source currency against the debtor party to the transfer, and a reservation in the target currency against the FXP. The stated parties to the transfer, i.e. the originators and recipients of the messages, will be different from the correct underlying parties, depending, as I say, on which party to the transfer is undertaking the currency conversion. And the plan, therefore, is that the hub will deterministically transform stated parties into the correct parties, and obligations will be created based on the reservations. So let's look now at how a reservation happens. Now, a reservation is made when execution is requested, of course. It must be in a currency in which the debtor party holds an account. Otherwise, we can't do the liquidity check. So these are the rules, I think. If the debtor party already holds an account in the currency of the request, then reserve funds against the debtor party's account, where there's no currency conversion, or where the debit party, the debtor party, is performing the conversion. If this is a request to execute a currency conversion, perform the reservation against the credit participant named in the dependent transfer. This is the case where currency conversion is being undertaken, payment versus payment, by the creditor party. If this is a request to execute a transfer, then perform the reservation against the account of the participant named in the first dependent transfer. This is the case where the debit party is performing a PVP currency conversion. So now we've got our reservations, we hope, in the correct accounts. We now need to convert them to obligations. So we'll now have 1, if there's no currency conversion, or 2, if there is a currency conversion, reservations against the transfer. We can recover the dependency list from the transaction object associated with the transfer ID. If there are no dependencies, then create an obligation between the account where the reservation is created and the analogous account for the participant identified in the transfer. Otherwise, we look at the dependencies. If the reservation referred to by the dependencies condition is against the debtor party, then it represents a currency conversion initiated by the debtor participant. So we should create an obligation between the account where the reservation is created and the analogous account of the participant in the dependency list, i.e. in this case, the FXP. The amount and currency of the obligation obviously are the same as the reservation. If the reservation referred to by the dependencies condition is against an FXP, then it represents a currency conversion initiated by the creditor participant. We need to create an obligation between the account where the reservation was created and the analogous account for the credit party for the transfer. The amount again and currency are the same as the reservation. So I think those are reliable rules. They will need to be worked through in some more detail with actual accounts. But in principle, that is the pattern, subject to correctness of the rules, that we propose to use for implementing currency conversion in Moduloop. Are there any questions?
I know there's a lot of chatter in the chat there.
A lot of chatter in the chat.
Yeah, I have one question. Jonathan's on the road, so he's asked me to ask the question. What is the timeline for the API assessment? If it's going
for the API?
Yeah. I'm assuming that the change to the API is going to be a period of time. Then, to be quite candid, all the changes required to support that across the platform, another period of time. But clearly the first point of approval is the API. Is that weeks away, months away?
Less than weeks away, I would hope. I mean, we spent a long period on this, and I think we are at a point where all of the currently outstanding objections are met by the proposal that we currently have.
Excellent. Good news. And indication of timeline for changes, is that in multiple PIs or achievable in a PI?
It's achievable in a PI.
Excellent. Good.
Right. James, you have your hand up. Is that sorry, Rob? One more question.
I had one more, I'm afraid. It was also on the debtor. It seems you gave the decision of where the FX happens to the debtor, FSP, even though the creditor FSP might offer better terms. Is that a correct understanding?
I think it's not a correct understanding. And the reason it's not a correct understanding is because of the agreement of terms. Now, as you know, the agreement of terms is at the behest of the creditor institution. And therefore, if, let's say, a currency, let's suppose that a debtor gets a quotation for currency conversion from their FXP and sends it with the request for quotation. If the creditor DFSP doesn't like that quotation, it can substitute a quotation of its own.
Excellent.
And when it sends back the terms, they will be sent back basically saying to the debtor DFSP, you may undertake this transfer, but if you do, you've got to use my conversion and not your conversion.
Okay, brilliant.
So that's possible.
So I'm just going to flag that one for Kareem, just to say that means there's a quote being used and therefore there is a requirement for a quote in an FX transfer.
Yes.
Okay. Kareem, if you're still on, if not, I'll make sure he flags that on the merchant's workstream. Thanks. That's all, Michael. Appreciate it.
No problem. James.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. My question was relating to the change to the get parties response.
Sorry. Yep.
The proposal is to just add a list of currencies that the recipient can receive in.
Yes.
Does it matter, or does it not matter, which those might be different accounts? Those might resolve to different accounts at the eventual recipient DFSP.
No, I don't think it. Well, I don't think it does, and the reason I don't think it does is that. The reason I don't think it does is that, in general, Moduloop does not state which accounts at an account holding institution should be credited or debited as a consequence of a payment. It's up to the DFSP to decide which accounts those are.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Okay.